Earthbound's entire existence has been incredibly rocky. There was a strict rule that you couldn't work on the game if you were married because of the ridiculous commitment it required. It faced countless delays from a team with seemingly no leadership and it being overcomplicated and oversized. One entry was worked on for 5 different consoles and took over a decade to finish. It has been accompanied by arguably one of the worst ad campaigns of all time, in which they may as well have told people not to buy their game. It has been burdened by constant localization issues to the point that they haven't even exported the most recent entry, going on almost 20 years from its initial release, despite constant fan campaigns asking for exactly that. The series' creator and its producer seemingly hated working together so much that they would argue about things as simple as commuting to work. And because series creator Shigesato Itoi was perpetually busy, the series almost died before it even started. Going back in time to the mid-1980s, Itoi, a heavy smoker with asthma, would often struggle to sleep at night due to his breathing issues. In those nights that sleep was seemingly off the table, he would pass the time by booting up his Famicom and playing Nintendo's new smash hit, Super Mario Bros. God, that feels so weird to say. Those sleepless nights spent with Nintendo's mascot's home console debut gave Itoi the feeling that he was indebted to the company, and it made him want to create a game for them. So one day when he was on a work trip with his day job to Nintendo headquarters, he first pitched his idea for a new RPG to none other than Shigeru Miyamoto. Itoi was an established copywriter and marketing guru who seemingly oozed ideas from every pore. But when he pitched his idea, Miyamoto rejected it. He acknowledged that it looked nice, but at this time he was hearing people pitch their ideas to him in every ear. Yeah, that's right, all 2 of them. Oh god, why did I write that? Miyamoto simply harbored doubts that Itoi could craft and complete a fully fledged RPG in a contemporary setting while also fully committing to the game's development. However, as you may have guessed, time would end up proving him terribly wrong. So Itoi left Nintendo disheartened with the result of his idea being stomped on, to the point that he recalled crying on the bullet train back home. However, rather than continuing to sulk in his despair, he instead decided to prove his dedication to making a video game by reducing his workload at his day job. Once he'd done that, the path was now clear for Mother to be worked on, and with Miyamoto's eventual approval, production on his game began immediately. Nevertheless, starting a project far from guarantees smooth sailing, and Mother was definitive proof that shit can still hit the fan and make a big stinky mess. With the game's greenlight, Itoi founded Ape Inc. in 1989 with a hefty investment from Nintendo to create his game with a team handpicked by Miyamoto himself and his loose oversight paired with them. And while he ended up credited as the game's producer, Miyamoto had Itoi do essentially all of the work himself to debunk any accusations from the press that this was nothing more than a celebrity endorsement by, quote, a copywriter not up to task. And throughout the game's development, with Itoi and Miyamoto's limited interactions, their relationship began to sour if it hadn't been already, given that one had already made the other cry and all. And Itoi, the creative mind behind the project, often felt somewhat belittled by Miyamoto, who was a tad more rooted in realism and expectations, having been through this game creation process once or twice before. Itoi recalled a sense of powerlessness when Miyamoto would stomp on his progress and explain that his ideas, while plentiful and incredible, were often simply impossible to pull off. Despite this tumultuous working relationship and environment, Miyamoto's confidence in the famed writer seemingly never wavered, so the project persisted despite the growing pains of a young team. And in 1989, Mother debuted in Japan for the Famicom and received critical acclaim. But in the months following its successful release, this series would have its first run-in with a massive problem that would come to define its tumultuous history. Mother, being a series of massive RPGs crafted by a proud and esteemed Japanese writer, faced a monumental undertaking when it came to exporting the game. The localization of the first entry took nearly 2 years, and by the time it was ready, Nintendo of America, after having subjected the game to extensive amounts of change, ended up altering a significant amount of the game's imagery and themes, and after the translation of well over 100 pages of scripts, Mother was considered unsuitable for release in the United States. So the finished product, in English, was left on a shelf in a dark closet at NOA headquarters for decades. But despite the failure on the other side of the Earth, things in Japan were only getting worse. Mother 2, or just Earthbound as we know it here, had just entered its own vicious development cycle, and on several accounts, was teetering on the brink of cancellation. Following the success of the first game domestically, nearly the entire development team at Ape Inc. was naturally overhauled, and even Miyamoto stepped away from the project for the most part. The new team was comprised of only unmarried individuals who were willing to work late nights to accommodate Itoi's rigorous and demanding schedule. And within this new all-bachelor team, progress began to slow dramatically, and production costs began to soar. They had to abandon numerous concepts and still found themselves needing a cartridge with 3 times more memory than they originally planned to house the game. And just as everything was crumbling and on the brink of collapse, help was sent in, and the arrival of a team from HAL Labs headed by future Nintendo president Satoru Iwata stepped in and swiftly righted the ship, saving this game from the grasps of death. So following over a year of delays, this game finally saw the light of day in Japan, where this time around they actually managed to localize it for release despite facing many of the same challenges as before, and they were now ready to release the game that was yet again thriving across the Pacific. With it slated to release in the summer of 1995, they unveiled it to the public with a brilliant marketing campaign worth an astounding $2 million. They rapidly spread these ads throughout the United States in mailers and magazines, and they utilized a revolutionary new technology and the trendiest of ideals at the time to ensure this game's success. The ambitious Nintendo of America marketing team took one of the year's biggest games and launched it with a scratch and sniff 90s gross out campaign using the slogan, "This game stinks." Now I want you guys to take a second and guess whether or not this game sold well in America. Got your answer? Yeah, it sold like ass. Whether this American team found that surprising or not is beyond me, but back in Japan, things were seeming great. The development team rode the wave of the second game's domestic success and promptly started working on the third installment, likely reusing assets for another one on the SNES. However, shortly after production began, the N64 emerged on the horizon, and the higher-ups mandated a transition to their first 3D console, believing that the game would thrive in a new 3-dimensional world. And despite this change, everyone believed that Mother 3's development would be smooth and wrinkle-free, but it ended up turning out to be a nightmare beyond anyone's imagination. This shift into the third dimension brought its own set of new and unique challenges as the team realized that 3D development was significantly more demanding and complex than 2D. That is, especially for a sleep-deprived team that weren't all too familiar with Z's. You see what I did there? I'm funny, I swear. While much of Mother 2's staff was retained for its sequel, the team was significantly expanded for the project that was already burdened with incredibly high expectations, even before the releases of Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time, which were both revolutionary genre-defining titles. Fans expected Mother 3 to do that for RPGs. But this game was far too ambitious for the N64, and Itoi recalled initially writing 12 chapters and only being able to implement about 3 of them. They had simply crafted a game significantly too large for the N64 and had to restructure almost everything to work on the new hardware, but even still, due to the increased memory the project required and the incredible amount of content to be cut, it had still exceeded the N64's memory limits and had to be transitioned to the console's disk drive expansion. And if you know the story of that add-on, you can probably guess what happened next. Mother 3 ended up facing several more delays, and the N64 DD went unreleased outside of a Japanese Sky Mart-esque magazine. And when they ended up attempting to transfer development back to the base cartridge, even more content needed to be cut, and even more delays arose. On top of that, Iwata, the man who had kept the previous entry from crumbling under its own weight, was spending more time in America, as he was transitioning from running HAL to heading Nintendo's planning department and wasn't able to oversee production nearly as closely. This dwindling oversight caused by his emergence within the company led to progress on the game slowing significantly, and it came to a point where more and more issues arose, and even Itoi's grand finale to Mother 3 was found to be impossible to execute on the N64. So with too much underlying programming still needed and the GameCube on the horizon, The team's deadline was clear, and it became evident that they just wouldn't reach it, as everything crumbled beneath them despite having the majority of the game's scenarios, characters, and writing complete. Just before Nintendo's Space World 2000 presentation, Shigesato Itoi announced to the public that Mother 3 had been cancelled. Miyamoto went on to elaborate that they started with the premise of needing to build a high-rise for Mother 3 so they couldn't just turn it into a wooden mansion halfway through. And with that, this game's fate was left up in the air, with Miyamoto refusing to promise a return to the project but not necessarily ruling it out either. They floated around the idea of continuing production on their next console, but the GameCube would just give them some tools to solve problems Mother 3 was facing, but no clear solutions. And there was an immense amount of pressure to deliver with this, and by the time they would finally be getting around to releasing a finished product, Itoi and Miyamoto agreed that a good bit of the writing and plot would have gone out of style. At this point, Itoi seemingly stepped away from the project, and no news emerged on the game's status for years. It appeared doomed to an eternity in purgatory after spending nearly a decade in the fiery pits of development hell. Itoi, having handed over Ape Inc. to the Pokemon Company, stepped away from video games outright and went back to what he was best known for, as well as running a daily microblog website. Don't worry, I didn't really know what that was either until I looked into this, but he was basically doing a Twitter before Twitter. Jumping back to Nintendo in the years following the debacle with this game, they were going on a remake frenzy of old games from the Famicom and Super Famicom, and Mother naturally wasn't immune to this craze. And after heavy pleas from Nintendo, Itoi stepped back up to re-release his games for the Game Boy Advance. Once his first two games were released bundled together for the handheld, Itoi's Not Twitter site began to blow up with requests from fans for him to finish his third game. Well, actually at this point it would have been his fourth. Who could forget Shigesato Itoi's #1 bass fishing? After this bombardment of rabid requests from his fans, he announced on his site that Mother 3 was finally going to be happening on the handheld console, and it was going to be based on his original story and development. So it seemed like Mother 3 would finally be completed, not on the GameCube or the N64, but a fifth piece of hardware more in line with the SNES's capabilities. And finally, in April of 2006, Mother 3 ultimately saw the light of day on the Game Boy Advance in Japan, a full 12 years after development initially began on the Super Nintendo. Despite this game being met with even more domestic success, things went sideways again on the export front as the series had seemingly all but become accustomed to. Localization for the West simply failed to proceed smoothly, likely due to the title's themes of grief and its references to drug usage and animal cruelty. Consequently, this game, much like the first in the series, remained confined to Japan, much to the dismay of all of its international fans who continue to clamor for its localized release to this day. But Mother 3 was completed almost 20 years ago now, and aside from the localized release of the first game finally arriving on the Wii U eShop in 2015, a full quarter century after its initial release, as well as its sequel accompanying it there, as well as both of their additions to Nintendo Switch Online in 2022, there has been absolutely no news of a fourth entry in the series, or even the localization of the third one. And Itoi, who has now moved on from the world of video games entirely, maintains that his series is now complete. So while Mother 4 will likely never happen, and I'm not learning Japanese specifically to play this anytime soon, I can't help but wonder why Nintendo has refused to localize the entire catalog. If you're determined enough, there is a fan translation out there that I hear a lot about, but unfortunately I'm not that driven, so I'm simply just waiting here in purgatory, aware that this game could release literally any day now, but could also be a relic of a series Nintendo has since long forgotten. But if you think Earthbound's past was rough, well, you're right, but if you were wondering what it were like if Itoi and the rest of the team were a little more determined, and had a little more pull at the company, the story of Pikmin is equally as absurd, and lucky for you, if you click the video on the screen right now, you can hear the story of how the Pikmin series has refused to die.